So far this semester, we have learned a lot about the body. In Anatomy 1, you ended talking about the nervous system, and we discussed how the nervous system secretes or helps stimulate the secretion of hormones in the endocrine system, and how those hormones are transported in the blood, which we then studied the blood and what the blood is made of. And then we studied the cardiovascular system, which moves the blood through the body in all the parts of the heart and the arteries and veins and the diffusion, the capillary beds. And then we talked about the lymphatic system and how when there's pressure in the capillary beds, interstitial fluid is released, and the lymphatic vessels pick up that lymph and move it back towards the heart. And then we learned about immunity, because in those lymph nodes, immune cells are combing, looking for foreign antigens to elicit a response and attack anything that may be going on in the body. And then we learned about the respiratory system and how oxygen is brought in from the external atmosphere and put into the blood, delivered to the cells of our systemic unit, and used for cell respiration. So the other part of that story is that for cells to do work, they need energy. And to harness the energy from the food, they needed oxygen. And now we're at how the food gets there. And so we jumped around a little bit, but it just seems to make more sense this way for me. So we're going to do chapter 17, which is the digestive system and excretion of your solid waste. And then in the next week, we will talk about your urinary system and excretion of your liquid waste. And that will lead us to looking at the parts of the reproductive system and a little bit on development. And that will be the end of the semester. Y'all are doing so well. Keep it up. And let's just dive into chapter 17, the digestive system. So most of your digestive system is this really long tube. They call your body a tube within a tube. It's open end to end to the outside, mouth and anus, right? It's your book says it's like an air within an air tunnel through a mountain. So the food substances that we the food substances that we eat don't actually get to the internal environment until they are absorbed. And before that happens, you've got to take all the food and break it down into all the small units, the monomers and maybe disaccharides, so like simple sugars, amino acids, nucleotides, the glycerols and the fatty acids from the lipids, and then we can absorb it. So depending on the chemical nature of your food is what needs to happen in the digestive system. And so what you see here in this picture is a scanning electron microscopy image of the mucosa in your stomach, so the gastric mucosa, and these are gastric pits, and so we'll be learning about what their purpose is. So I'm excited. One of my favorite units, because I hope, like me, you love to eat. So digestion is this mechanical, this physical breakdown and the chemical breakdown of foods into forms that the actual cell membranes can absorb. And so mechanical just means let's take something large and put it into smaller pieces. That doesn't change the chemical composition, it's just smaller size. What that's going to do is increase the surface area of that food particle so that we can do better and more efficient chemical digestion. The chemical digestion is going to use the enzymes that break that food down and do chemically change it into smaller, simpler chemicals that can be absorbed. So your digestive system carries all of this out, and it includes ingestion, propulsion, absorption, and defecation. And we're talking about the alimentary canal, this tube within a tube, and all the little accessory organs that help it function. So we do look at the two portions, like I mentioned. The alimentary canal is your food passageway. So it goes all the way from mouth to anus, and that's going to include the mouth. The pharynx, we know about the pharynx, right? We just learned about naso-oro-laryngopharynx. Well, we're not talking naso anymore because you're not sticking food up your nose. But oropharynx is going to have food in it. Esophagus, stomach, and then it goes to the small intestine, large intestines, and then your anal canal. And it is made of smooth muscle. It's definitely not skeletal muscle. You don't choose to move your stomach, choose to move your intestines, and it's not cardiac. So it's about 8 meters long when stretched end to end. Don't ask how they know that. Accessory organs are all the organs that are going to secrete things into that alimentary canal to help with the chemical digestion of your food. So there's never food in these organs. They're always providing chemistry to make those chemical reactions happen. So this will be salivary glands, your liver, your gallbladder, and your pancreas. And so here are some pictures of your digestive system. And so on the right, they have everything that's listed about your alimentary canal, and it's labeled from mouth to anus. And then here are your accessory organs, just 4 of them. And then there's those 8 meters long or whatever of your alimentary canal separated. So the wall of your canal is 4 layers, and we're starting deep to superficial. Most deep is this mucosa, the innermost layer, right? We know that mucosa always lines closed cavities. So, sorry, open cavities. My bad. Serous membranes line closed cavities, which is down here. Okay, so mucosa, open cavities. You can put your finger in it. Mucosa lining, mucus in your nose, mucus in your mouth. Okay, so this whole canal from mouth to anus is lined with mucosa. It is folded to increase the surface area. Remember, more surface area allows more absorption, diffusion, osmosis, that kind of thing. And it also absorbs nutrients. It can secrete mucus and enzymes in the mucosa lining, like the, what are they called? I just lost it. It's some specific cell that secretes mucus. Oh well, we're letting it go. Submucosa. Remember that sub means below, like a submarine. So below the mucosa, if the mucosa is this inner layer, right, this inner layer, the submucosa is going to be beneath that. So we're working deep to superficial. And so here's going to be your submucosa in this area. Now, it's connective tissue. Mucosa is going to be epithelial tissue, right? Mucous membranes are epithelial. And then you've got this connective tissue supporting it, nourishing the cells. Oh my gosh, there's blood associated with that. And helps transport these food. And then the next layer, right, is going to be muscularis. So I'm going to draw some M's. This is all your smooth muscle. So this is what's going to kind of milk the food down. Now you have muscle lining the length of your alimentary canal. They're going to call those longitudinal layers of muscle. And then you have rings of muscle going around this tube. Remember, we just kind of cut the tube in half. So we've got muscle running this way and up and down the length of the tube. So circular and longitudinal layers. And that's all about helping, move food around and mix it up. And then the final layer is our serosa. And serosa is going to be what's lining any cavity that is closed. So it's going to be on the outside of an organ and then in that peritoneum. So we're talking about visceral and parietal peritoneum. So this would be the visceral because it's right on the, on the organ. And then as this connects to the inside of the body, you have this body cavity. This would be this is an awful picture of a human. It looks more like a hamburger sideways. But anyway, so this is the serosa. I just kind of had fun drawing, sorry. Oh no, I always forget I have to erase it. There we go. So what is the function of all this? Mucosa is all about that epithelial lining is secretion mainly, a little bit of a protection, and then absorbing, because we are going to have to get these monomers into the blood system. The submucosa nourishes all the tissues, it's vascular, and then your muscularis obviously is muscle to move, and then serosa is always for protection of and to lubricate. It's got that double membrane, the visceral and the parietal, with the fluid in between, to help protect the organs of that system. So here you see a great picture of part of the alimentary canal. This is a good picture where you can see the different layers of tissue. So right in here is all this mucosa, some of it's folded for that increased surface area. And then you've got a layer of connective tissue that the epithelial sits on. And then you have your muscles, and these are the circular muscles that go around the tube, and here's the longitudinal ones that can kind of push things down the tube. And this is like to knead the food down, milk the food down. And then your mesentery just kind of propels this organ, like hangs it. Your serosa is that outer layer lining the cavity. So this would be the visceral peritoneum. All right, so if we cut a piece of that out and look at it closely, we'll see that our mucosa does have some villi, and this is just for more surface area. That's going to be the word of the unit, so you're going to get tired of hearing that. When in doubt, the answer is surface area. And then here's the submucosa, right? Connective tissue. So probably some dense irregular tissue here, and then of course you have your vascular tissue, some lymphatics going on, nerves running through here, mucus glands. And then here's your muscle, and I love it because you can see all these units of muscle, and here are the longitudinal muscles and the circular muscles that would go around. And if you cut into one of these lacteals, or sorry, villi, and you can look closely at the lacteal. Now the lacteal is just this dead end of our lymphatic system, right? And you should notice that because it's really closely associated with our capillaries. So as pressure's pushing blood to this area, some of it's leaked and this is pulled up. We're going to see Peyer's patches in here. If you remember that increased in density as you go down the intestines, because the chance for bacteria getting in here is higher. So we're going to really need some immune system support in this area. That's why that lacteal is there. And then you can see that this is like the connective tissue. And then here's our simple epithelial tissue. Looks like simple columnar to me, right? And you zoom in and you can, there, a goblet cell, that's what I was talking about, that secretes the mucus of the mucosa. So, and they even have microvilli. So you have villa, you have simple columnar epithelial, and then you have microvilli. So what is the term for the unit? Lots of surface area. Why? To get more secretions out, to absorb more stuff in, to be as efficient as we can. So there are two movements in the alimentary canal. There's mixing and there's propelling. So in mixing, your muscle in small sections is going to contract, and it doesn't really move materials in one direction. And we see this in the small intestines. We see churning in the stomach. But to propel means to move it into one direction. And the science word we're going to use is peristalsis, where this contraction, this milking action progresses down a tube, and that pushes things in a wave-like motion. And so you can see in this picture, this is churning back and forth, mixing. This is churning, mixing, but this is propelling. We're going in one direction. And these muscles, these circular muscles are pinching together while longitudinal muscles are contracting too. And so you have all this going on. So what nerves are controlling all this? Well, it's sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions that control the alimentary canal. Your submucosal plexus controls secretions. Your mesenteric plexus controls gastrointestinal motility. Your autonomic control of your digestive system includes your parasympathetic and sympathetic impulses. So remember, parasympathetic is like paradise, rest and relaxation. So when you're resting and you're relaxing, you're in paradise, you are increasing the digestive system. When I go to paradise, I want to sit down under like a tiki tent, drink and eat and be merry. So my digestive system is going to increase. The sympathetic impulse would do the opposite. Sympathetic is fight or flight. And so we're not really worried about eating so much if we're being chased by, I don't know, a lion. So you are going to stop secretions, stop motility with a sympathetic impulse. But with a parasympathetic impulse, you're going to increase all of that. And that's autonomic, right? It happens without you having to think about it. There's enteroendocrine cells, and these are found in the stomach and the small intestines, and they're going to secrete a little bit of hormones, and this will help regulate some of the organs. Probably not going to be tested about that. So let's start at the beginning, right, with your mouth, the very first part of your alimentary canal, and the purpose of it is to ingest food. Just get the food in the canal. Mastication is the science word for mechanical breakdown of solid particles, and you mix them with your saliva. Of course, your mouth is important for speech and other senses, and you have lips and cheeks and tongue and a palate and the oral cavity and a vestibule. Lingual frenulum right here holding your tongue, the inferior labial frenulum holding your lip. The oral vestibule is the space, I guess, where you'd keep your dip if you were doing that sort of thing. We know where our lips are. We know, I think, where our tongue is. This is the uvula and your tonsils. We've studied tonsils before. Your soft palate's back here. It is soft to the touch because there is no bone. But above your hard palate, you have your maxilla and your palatine bone of the facial skull, or facial bones of the skull, and then you have your lip. So what are cheeks? Well, they're the lateral wall of your mouth. They help you chew and give expression. They have an inner lining of stratified squamous epithelium, and it is always moist in there, right? So stratified squamous because there's going to be some abrasion on your cheeks, especially like if you eat chips and they're real crunchy and they're sharp and they scratch the internal lining of your cheek. You're not bleeding because you have lots of layers of squamous epithelial tissue. It's made that way to protect the underlying connective tissue and vascular system in the cheek. Your lips are very movable, and they totally surround your mouth. Hair doesn't grow here. That's kind of interesting, like on your lip. They do have some receptors that can determine temperature and texture, and sometimes we put lipstick on them. Your tongue is a thick muscular organ that sits on the floor of your mouth, and it has some major parts associated with it. So I already mentioned the lingual frenulum connects your tongue to the floor of your mouth. If you've ever heard of somebody being tongue-tied, sometimes they get the lingual frenulum clipped to release their tongue. And then you have papilla, which are projections on the tongue that help move food, and also they contain some taste buds. So you have different tastes. What are your tastes? Let's see, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, which is delicious. And then your lingual tonsils are lymphatic tissues at the root of the tongue. And so here are palatine tonsils and lingual tonsils towards the back. Your epiglottis, remember that cartilaginous flap. Here, the root of the tongue, the majority of the tongue is called body, and here's these little papilla. They help move food around a little bit and like grip, but they also have our taste buds. Your palate is the roof of your mouth, which is why that bone called the palatine bone is there. the anterior portion is hard, so if you put your thumb on the roof of your mouth, you can feel these bones here, and then the back part is soft, and so that's going to be just some muscles, and your uvula will be there, hanging down. Your palatine tonsils, we mentioned, are masses of lymphatic tissue on the sides of the tongue, and pharyngeal tonsils, also called your adenoids, are on the wall of your pharynx. And so here is this tongue and your palatine tonsil, lingual tonsils on the back of your tongue. This is that uvula hanging down. Here's your hard palate. So this is maxilla. This is part of the palatine, I bet. And this is the oropharynx. Your teeth are the hardest structures in your body, and they are not part of your skeleton system. Why? Well, they're not made of bone. The human dentition is an omnivore, so even if you're choosing to be a vegetarian, genetically you're created to eat both flesh and vegetables. So you have 20 primary or deciduous teeth. Deciduous, like the deciduous forest, if you're in Arkansas, you live in the deciduous forest. That means that most of our trees are going to lose their leaves. So this just means to fall out. And so these teeth do fall out and are replaced with 32 secondary or permanent teeth. So you've got some different types of teeth. Central incisors, we're working from the inside out. Lateral incisors, so the two incisors, I'm touching mine as I say this, your canines, then you have premolar, first premolar, and then first molar, second molar, third molar. And so all of these teeth are used to break down things into smaller pieces. So we called that mechanical digestion earlier, remember? So what are we going to do? We're also going to break it down to mix our food with some enzymes. Now your incisors are for biting, canines are tearing, grasping flesh, and the molars and premolars are for grinding plant material like starches and cellulose that's found in the cell wall of the plants. The teeth consist of a crown with a root, and they meet at the neck where the lining of your gum is. Enamel covers your crown, and dentin makes up most of the tooth. And so because our teeth are made of dentin, they're not considered bone. The periodontal ligament holds a root in place along with some cementum. And so here are pictures of primary teeth, and then your secondary teeth are kind of waiting in the wings to push out. So as these secondary teeth move down, they are going to push the primary teeth. One thing you can tell about primary teeth is sometimes they're called milk teeth, right? They're smooth, they're not rigid, where your secondary teeth are going to have these ridges. So here's just showing your incisors. So central and lateral. Remember, lateral means on the side, central, center. So you have your canine, your premolar, and your molars. And then, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 teeth here, 8 teeth here. That's 16 on top, 16 on bottom. They match the top, and that's a total of 32. So here's the parts of the tooth, the crown of the tooth. This is why they say you're going to go get a crown. You're going to, they're not replacing the whole thing. They're just covering this top part, which is covered with enamel, a protective layer, and then most of the tooth is made of dentin. In the pulp, you'll see arteries and veins, and a root canal, which is the nervous fibers. And then an alveolar process are these bumps in the bone of your maxilla or your mandible, depending on, are you talking about upper teeth or lower teeth? But cementum and the periodontal ligaments adhere the root to the bone. This is, I believe, supposed to say dental cavities, and the book that your book that I stole this PowerPoint from calls it dental caries. So I don't know. Dental caries. Whatever. Cavities. within the enamel of a tooth are formed when sticky food lodges between your teeth and bacteria, eat the food. And when bacteria eat, they release some acid byproduct, and that starts to destroy the enamel and dentin. And a cavity is a hole. So what should you do? Well, you should brush and floss, go to your dental exams, get clean, have some fluoride treatments, and get sealants. These did not exist when I was little. My son has these, but I'm a big supporter of flossing and brushing. So here are the parts of the mouth and where you can find them and what they do. So let's talk about one of our accessory organs, the salivary glands. And the whole point of a salivary gland is to secrete saliva. It is a merocrine gland, so this is made of epithelial tissue, and the purpose of the saliva is to moisten the food and help bind it together, and some of the saliva actually has some enzyme in it. So this enzyme, excuse me, breaks down starch. And so this enzyme is called amylase, A-M-Y-L-A-S-E, and it is found in your saliva. This is where digestion first takes place. While we are just mechanically digesting in the mouth, or a lot of people think that's all we're doing, we're also chemically digesting here because we have an enzyme at work. Now, the pH in your mouth is about a 7, which is what salivary amylase works best at, and that helps protect your teeth from acidic food. So these enzymes help do all that. So you have parotid glands, submandibular glands, and sublingual glands. Your parotid are your largest, and they are the ones that secrete the amylase. On the floor of your mouth, below, mandibular, floor of your mouth, is going to be serous and mucus glands. And so mucus solution. And then sublingual glands are found under the tongue, and they're going to secrete mucuses. So couple minor glands scattered throughout the mucosa, but the whole point is keep the lining of the mouth moist. What do you want to focus on here? I would start this parotid gland. It's the one with the amylase. This is the first place we're seeing chemical digestion happen in the body. So the different pairs of salivary glands have different types of secretory cells. You have serous and mucus cells like we talked about. So serous cells produce watery fluid, and we call that salivary amylase. Amylase does take starch, which is a polysaccharide, and breaks it down into glycogen, and takes glycogen and breaks it into disaccharides. Glycogen is the other polysaccharide. Mucus cells, well, they secrete mucus, and that's all about lubrication. So here are your 3 glands, where they're found, where their ducts are. So these are all exocrine glands because they are releasing chemicals or their secretions to the outside, and then the type of secretion that they make, and where the major salivary glands are. I don't know if y'all can gleek, but I can squirt liquid out of my mouth from my duct. My brother taught me that when I was really young. So proud. Sublingual, below lingual tongue. So sublingual, submandibular, below the mandible. Parotid gland, the largest one. And then here's pictures of these salivary glands. Moving on to the pharynx. Now pharynx and larynx, remember that? Larynx was our voice box. We're not using that in the digestive system, but we still have a throat. And so they don't really help with food digestion at all. They are just passageways. They have muscular walls, and their job is to move the food from the first place in the mouth where digestion began to the next place. So the pharynx is the cavity posterior to the mouth, goes from nasal to esophagus. We've learned these in the last unit: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Remember that nasopharynx, air passage only, not food at all. Oropharynx, you're going to have food here. And then, of course, laryngopharynx is coming next to the larynx. But we're not going into the trachea, we're going to the esophagus. So the esophagus is this tubular organ that goes from the pharynx to the stomach. And so here you can see some muscles of the pharyngeal wall. Here's the epiglottis. You can see all these just different muscles helping you swallow. Fun, not tested. So swallowing, interesting, can be thought of in 3 stages. The first stage is where you choose to do it. It's voluntary. You have saliva, you're mixing it with food. You form a little ball of food that you're going to swallow called a bolus. Super interesting that they have measured the size of boluses and found that the size of your bolus is actually a genetic trait. So some families have a larger bolus that they form before they swallow than others. I think that's pretty cool. Second stage, this starts as food reaches your oropharynx, and now you're stimulating sensory receptors, and that's going to cause a reflex. So it's no longer voluntary, like things are going to happen, man, without you even trying. So lots of stuff here in the second phase. The soft palate, remember that's back in the back of your mouth where there's not bone, there's just a muscular arch, and your uvula rise up. And that helps close off the nasal cavity because we do not want food in the nasopharynx. The hyoid bone, which is where your tongue is attracted, is the only floating bone in your body. And the larynx, they all come up. And that closes the epiglottis off to the larynx. And that protects the trachea because you don't want food in the trachea. This is the air pipe, the wind pipe, not the food tube. The longitudinal muscles of your pharynx squeeze, and that pushes the food down. The inferior constrictor muscles relax, and that opens the esophagus open. That opens the esophagus and allows the food to be squeezed into it. And then you have these peristaltic waves. Remember these milking waves that force food down into the esophagus. The last stage, as peristalsis transports food, you go all the way from the swallowing down the esophagus to the stomach. So here are the steps in your swallowing reflex. You use your tongue to push the bolus back. The bolus is this big green thing. Once you get it back here, autonomic nervous system kind of takes over, and the uvula and the soft palate move up. The hyoid bone moves up. That's going to close off this trach. That's going to close off this nasopharynx, and now we can move our bolus down the esophagus through peristaltic waves until we get to the stomach. About the esophagus, it's just a muscular passageway. It does go through the diaphragm. So when you're dissecting, students want to cut this because it's inconvenient. The diaphragm is penetrated by it. So, and it goes through what's called the esophageal hiatus. It contains, the esophagus has mucus glands in the submucosa, and that's going to moisten and lubricate the bolus and all the food that's moving down. We got stratified squamous epithelium to protect our esophagus, and our muscularis, the superior 1/3 is skeletal, so it's attached to skeleton. The middle third is skeletal and smooth, and then the last is just smooth muscle. I just think this is interesting. You probably don't, and you won't be tested on it, so don't worry about that. The lower esophageal sphincter or cardiac sphincter, they named it cardiac sphincter because it's near the heart. Don't think that this is attaching to the heart. We're going to the stomach, but this is what regulates the food entering the stomach. So a sphincter is like a noose of muscle that can tighten and close or relax and open. And so this cardiac sphincter allows passage of food from the esophagus into the stomach, and then it closes to prevent regurgitation of food as your stomach starts to contract and do the mixing and churning for mechanical and chemical digestion. So you can see your long esophagus leading from your laryngopharynx all the way down to the esophageal hiatus, and there would be a cardiac sphincter right here. And so here's inside the esophagus wall, esophageal wall, and you can see the mucosa lining, the submucosa, the muscles. So now we are in the stomach. The stomach is a pouch-like organ. It can expand. It has, it's just inferior to the diaphragm. Remember that the esophagus had to go through the diaphragm. So it's in the upper left portion of your abdominal cavity. They have rugae, and these are folds of the lining, and this allows for distension. This is not for surface area. So this is the one time we're saying this. Your stomach's like an empty bag, right? An empty bag, if you were to be inside of an empty bag, you would see all these folds. But as the bag fills up, those folds go away. That allows distension. So that's what the rugae are for. So what is the stomach's function? It receives food from the esophagus. It's going to mix it with all these gastric juices. This is where protein digestion first starts. It doesn't really absorb a whole lot, and then it just moves stuff on to the next thing, which is the small intestines. And there are some layers of smooth muscle in the stomach. There's the circular layer, a longitudinal layer, and then you have some oblique fibers running so that you can do all this unique churning and moving. There are 4 parts of the stomach. The cardia, remember I said that this area, the cardiac sphincter, it's near the heart, and so that's why it's named that. The fundus, which is this upper curve, the body is the majority of it, and then the pylorus is down here where it starts to narrow like a neck, and we're going to get to the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter is going to control moving fluids onto the small intestine. The cardiac sphincter is controlling moving fluids into the stomach. And here's all these different muscular layers that allow the churning and mechanical digestion of food. So like I mentioned, the cardia region is near the opening of the esophagus. It has the esophageal sphincter there. The fundus is that round part that raises up. And if you overeat or eat a lot, it is a temporary food storage. This is where air will accumulate, and if you burp, that was fun, and so that air came from probably your fundus. The body is the main portion, and then the pylorus is the most distal portion, close to the small intestines. As I mentioned, it narrows like a neck and leads to the pyloric sphincter, which again is a muscular noose, if you will. As it contracts, it closes off, and it will control the food moving out of the, well, it won't be food anymore, but what was food out of the stomach. So let's talk about some gastric secretions, and then we'll just take a little break. So the gastric glands have 3 types of secretory cells, and they all produce a mixture called gastric juice. So here's what gastric juice is made out of. There's pepsinogen, pepsin, gastric lipase, hydrochloric acid, mucus, and intrinsic factors. So pepsinogen is an inactive form of pepsin, and these chief cells release it. And so that's really what you want to focus on is chief cells in the stomach release pepsinogen, okay? Now pepsinogen doesn't do crap. It's in active form. But when it gets activated by hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen becomes pepsin. And pepsin is now active enzyme, and it's what breaks proteins down into polypeptides and even just amino acids. And so you have to have the presence of hydrochloric acid to change your pepsinogen made by the chief cells into the pepsin to break down the protein. Pepsin, pepsinogen, protein. Gastric lipase. Anything that ends in ase is always an enzyme, and lip or lip means fat. So this is breaking down fat. It doesn't do a whole lot of this, and it's actually inhibited by the low pH. So we're in the stomach, there is a low pH, it's acidic in here. So not a whole lot going on, but it is found here. Of course, hydrochloric acid is needed to activate the pepsin from pepsinogen, and it's made from parietal cells. Mucus secreted by mucus cells are going to protect the lining, right? Oh my gosh, it's so acidic. The hydrochloric acid is like a 2 on the pH scale. That's a ton of hydrogen ions. That could really damage your tissues. So you are constantly creating mucus in your stomach to protect that stomach lining. Intrinsic factors are produced also by parietal cells, and they are required for the absorption of vitamin B12. So here are the major components of gastric juice, where they come from, and what they do. And we are going to pause here and review in our next video. Take a break, go get you something to eat, right? Try some of this out. Think about your bolus. How big is your bolus? When can you control swallowing? When can't you? Enjoy.